Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's some of the stories we're covering for you today. Richmond, Virginia removes a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. A historian tells us why removing history may not be the answer. The Department of Labor says the U.S. economic recovery is looking good despite the small jobs report. Less people are filing for unemployment, and this week, two major pandemic unemployment programs are set to expire. The State Department says there are around 100 Americans waiting to leave Afghanistan, but some peg that number to be much higher. Reports of the Taliban blocking flights and holding them hostage are starting to raise concerns. As the U.S. leaves Afghanistan, a solid alliance between the Taliban and the Chinese Communist Party appears to be on the horizon. Virginia took down a statue of General Robert E. Lee. That's after the state Supreme Court voted to allow its removal. This was the largest Confederate statue remaining in the country. The statue was hoisted off the pedestal and cut into two pieces for transport. Crews will remove the plaques from the base of the monument on Thursday. The state will keep it in a storage facility and decide what to do with it at a later date. The statue is 21 feet long and arrived in 1890 from France, where it was built. The mayor of Richmond says the statue and legacy of Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy no longer reflect the city's reality. The state's governor pushed for the removal of the statue in the aftermath of the BLM riots following the death of George Floyd. Here with us to discuss the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue and what it means for a culture when it starts to erase its own history is historian Phil Magness. Phil, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Phil, there has been a leftist Marxist undercurrent in the United States which seeks to change or erase history as we know it. We see this in the 1619 Project that was endorsed by the New York Times, as well as the Marxist revolutionaries who are targeting statues from Abraham Lincoln to Jesus Christ. What are some of the real underlying reasons you think that these statues are being targeted?
Well, when I look at some of the statue removal, statue targeting that we're seeing across the country, and it's not just Confederate monuments, they've moved into other areas. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, even Frederick Douglass statues have been vandalized over the last year. And unfortunately, what I think we are seeing here is an iconoclastic movement that's built around political symbolism. They're trying to get an easy fix to some very complex societal problems, but they're doing it in such a way that it approaches, if we tear down the statue, that's going to fix racism in America. That's absurd. It's actually a focus on something that they can rage against very publicly, and politicians such as Governor Northam in Virginia can make a public stance against, but they aren't really doing anything to address some of the problems that they claim are their grievances.
Now, when it comes to the statue of Robert E. Lee, a Confederate general, why should this statue remain, and what are the dangers of erasing these parts of our history from your perspective?
Well, I see something like the Lee statue, it needs to be viewed and understood in its historical context. This was built in 1890, and it was built in the middle of an era when there were veterans reunions ongoing after the Civil War. There were attempts to reunite the country after this catastrophic war. Yes, there were racial elements in that era that do loom over the way that those statues were constructed. But I think as historians, our objective here is not to dictate how the past should be commemorated, but to interpret it. And that interpretation involves not just going around smashing down statues, tearing down figures that we dislike now. It involves actually putting historical context on why these monuments were constructed in the first place. It also involves adding to the landscape of monuments. So there is room for abolitionist monuments, civil rights figures to be added to the landscape of many of our cities. And that seems to be a much more constructive approach to how we interpret the past than just going around tearing down any statue that we suddenly deem politically unfashionable.
Do you think that by having these statues in sight for people to see provides an opportunity to continue the conversation and reflect?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. When you see a statue, you start to wonder who this figure is, why a prior generation thought it was worthwhile to commemorate or honor that person. It also allows us a point of contrast to consider if we still view that person as someone we want to honor in such a way. but that's a conversation that needs to be had. These statues are in many ways like historical documents, and this is true of statuary going all the way back to the ancient world. We have surviving statues of Roman emperors and figures from the ancient world that many of them did things that we now view as very ugly in their lifetimes, but they are historical records and documents. To have a statue of Julius Caesar, to have a statue of other figures from history tells us why people saw those figures as important in their own times. And we can't understand that. We can't even begin to interpret it if our first instinct is to go around with a hammer and smash things that we don't like.
Phil Magness, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Now an update on the chaos in Afghanistan. The State Department says there are still around 100 Americans stuck in the country after the U.S. evacuation mission ended 1 week ago. But some are pegging that number to be much higher, at around 500 Americans stranded in the country. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says they're still working with the Taliban to get more people out.
To make sure that charter flights carrying Americans or others to whom we have a special responsibility can depart Afghanistan safely. Without personnel on the ground, we can't verify the accuracy of manifests, the identities of passengers, flight plans, or aviation security protocols. So this is a challenge.
Biden administration officials say the reason for reports of 500 Americans still stuck in Afghanistan is that some people were torn between leaving and staying and had not yet made up their mind. The administration has declined to heed Republican calls to give a full number because the administration says the number is constantly fluctuating as more people leave and are confirmed. Afghanistan-based nonprofit Ascend says that 600-plus Afghans, in addition to 19 Americans, were being prevented from leaving the Mazar-e-Sharif airport. And House Foreign Affairs Ranking Member Michael McCall said 6 planes were being prevented from leaving the facility and that the Taliban was holding Americans hostage. The Secretary of State will testify before the Senate next week about the Afghanistan withdrawal. It's being reported that the Taliban has invited China to attend the upcoming inaugural ceremony of the new Afghan government. A Taliban spokesperson has recently praised Beijing as being a main partner. As the U.S. leaves Afghanistan after 20 years, it appears a solid alliance between the Taliban and the Chinese Communist Party is on the horizon. China is our main partner and represents for us a fundamental and extraordinary opportunity because it is willing to invest and rebuild our country. This is said by a Taliban spokesperson. This is not the first time the Taliban is making a warm gesture to Beijing. Even before the Taliban made their push into Kabul, the leadership was building diplomatic ties with the Chinese Communist Party. The Taliban's senior leadership visited China in July and offered security assurances. In another call with Chinese officials earlier this month, a senior Taliban leader vowed that they will absolutely not allow any forces to threaten Chinese interests. Referring to Uyghur militants in Xinjiang, a region bordering Afghanistan, where Beijing has locked up more than 1 million ethnic Muslim minorities in internment camps. Thousands of Uyghurs in Afghanistan fear for their lives. They fear that the Taliban could deport them to China to gain more favor and monetary support from the Chinese regime.
Well, China has a real problem with the Taliban, so they're going to try to work out some arrangement with the Taliban, I'm sure. As does Pakistan, as does Russia, as does Iran. They're all trying to figure out what do they do now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
The United States blocked the Taliban from accessing billions of Afghan assets held in U.S. banks, while the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have each suspended funding to Afghanistan. Money has become a pressing concern for the Taliban. With cash running short, the Taliban appears to be placing its bet on Beijing. The Taliban spokesperson said the Taliban was very keen on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a billion-dollar infrastructure project that aims to expand the CCP's economic and political influence around the world. The spokesperson added, China is their gateway to markets around the world. They also referenced China's dormant investment in a copper mine development project in the country. How China bonds with the Taliban is being closely watched by the U.S. and the international community. Although the CCP has yet to formally recognize the Taliban regime, Beijing is reported to be on the guest list for the Taliban's inaugural ceremony. The 6 countries invited are China, Pakistan, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Qatar. And now we'll take a look at the economic recovery. Less people are filing for unemployment. This as 2 major pandemic unemployment programs end this week. NTD's Melina Wisecup joins us to discuss the latest on the economic front. Melina, so what are some key takeaways from the latest Labor Department reports?
Steve, some are calling this the largest cutoff of unemployment benefits in history. This week, around 7.5 million Americans lost that $300 unemployment boost, and the White House says they are not planning to extend it. But it does seem like reasonable timing, Steve. This latest report by the Labor Department shows that significantly less people are filing for unemployment. Claims have hit a pandemic-era low at 5.2%. Also, long-term unemployment claims are down, and for people who have gone back to work, they're making more. The report shows that the average wage earnings among workers has actually surged last month, Steve.
I see. So what exactly is the Labor Department saying about how the recovery is looking right now?
Steve, the Department of Labor Secretary Marty Walsh says that the economy is moving forward and recovering. He also says that the labor market is ready for those benefits to end. Of course, this cutoff of federal benefits is going to be tough for some of those Americans who are going to have less money coming in for now. Some progressive lawmakers here are calling for an extension to these benefits. For example, Representative Jamal Bowman from New York said, quote, "We need to extend the expanded UI for millions of unemployed workers because this crisis isn't over." He says people are still dealing with COVID and climate change, referring to the flooding, the heat waves, and the wildfires. But some others are of the opinion that this end of federal benefits will actually spur the economy towards a more productive direction, since people will have no choice but to get back to work. That's especially been the view of Republicans, especially from those states where the governors ended those extra benefits early, pretty much telling the federal government, we don't need your extra money. We also heard from business owners in New York City as well as here in DC who said they were having a hard time finding workers since people were making more on those extra benefits than they would have if they had gone back to work. And right now there are still more open positions than there are people unemployed. There are around 10 million job openings. 8.4 million people are unemployed. So maybe this end to these extra benefits will push more people back into the workforce and filling some of those open positions. Steve?
Thanks for that, Melina. And even as the unemployment rate is down and job openings are up, the White House did get a discouraging jobs report. Just over 200,000 jobs were created in August, less than half the amount of what the experts predicted. Also a dramatic decline from the over 1 million jobs created in July. President Biden claims this is because of the Delta variant and the unvaccinated. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans have experienced weather disasters this summer, from heat waves and tornadoes to the latest hurricane, which brought flooding from Louisiana to the Northeast. A new Washington Post article found that at least 388 Americans have died due to hurricanes, floods, heat waves, and wildfires in the past 3 months. 32% of people across America live in a county with a weather disaster being declared, while 64% of individuals live in an area crushed by extreme heat waves. Most recently, Hurricane Ida killed over 50 people along the East Coast. Earlier this summer, days of heat waves attacked the Pacific Northwest. Throughout the past few months, firefighters have been battling wildfires out west. We speak to a former far-left activist and BLM supporter who says she changed her views after seeing the hypocrisy from those around her. And the new Mu variant has been detected in every state in the U.S. except for Nebraska. As cases, hospitalizations, and deaths increase, President Biden says he has a plan. The latest variant of the CCP virus has been detected in every state in the U.S. except for Nebraska. The Mu variant, first detected in Colombia back in January, has been gaining prevalence in the United States and in other countries in recent weeks. As of September 7th, roughly 2,300 cases of the new variant have been detected in the U.S., with Nebraska being the only state without one. The state with the most cases thus far is California. Scientists there have found 399 cases. Florida has found 305 cases of the Mu variant, New York 203, and Texas has found 120. The World Health Organization warned that this variant could be even more resistant to the current vaccines. This week, the U.S. exceeded 40 million total cases of the CCP virus since the pandemic began. The Delta variant remains by far the most dominant strain. As cases, hospitalizations, and deaths increase, President Biden says he plans on presenting what he's calling a six-pronged strategy on Thursday. A group is seeking the release of hundreds of people accused of committing crimes in Washington on January 6th. They are planning to hold a rally at the U.S. Capitol on September 18th. Look Ahead America is organizing the rally. The nonprofit group says it advocates for Americans who are ignored by both political parties and the government. More than 600 people have been charged with a range of crimes for alleged actions in early January at the U.S. Capitol. Many of those charged remain in jail pending trial, including some who are being held for nonviolent crimes. At the end of August, middle school music teacher Sam Crowley resigned from his teaching job at the Draper Park Middle School. The middle school Crowley worked at had implemented a curriculum called SEL, or Social Emotional Learning. This curriculum claims to focus on equity and social justice. However, many are saying that these types of words and phrases have become buzzwords for Marxist and communist groups in an effort to transform public opinion favorably toward them. After digging into the curriculum, Crowley explained in his resignation letter that he could not in good conscience teach his students material which teaches students that their parents are, quote, roadblocks to their goals, material which contains propaganda and encourages students to become activists, among other things.
It just felt really anti-family. The students were told that older generations, which is just nice language for mom and dad and grandma and grandfather, that the older generations don't know or haven't had to face or think about the problems that we're dealing with today. And so, I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, well, you just told all of the students we can't look to mom and dad for help or for counsel or for guidance. Well, who does that leave? That leaves the system, that leaves the government, that leaves the school, it leaves somebody else, and not mom and dad. And family is the basic unit of society. We have to protect families. Mom and dad are important.
Upon submitting his 2-week notice to the school, Crowley was told he could leave on the following day. Amala Epinobi from PragerU, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Amala, you actually grew up in a very liberal household, I believe.
I did.
You were a volunteer for the Democrat Party?
Yeah, I was a paid worker for the leftist organization back in Florida that I was working for.
Wow. So tell us about the process that helped you move away from some of these ideas.
Great. So right out of high school, I started working for this left-leaning organization. They hired me as a youth organizer. So I was traveling around to middle schools and high schools, finding kids that were left-leaning. Maybe they were running Democratic clubs or something of that nature. And I found those kids, recruited them into the organization, and essentially turned them into little activists. They were going to protests. They were knocking doors and canvassing. They were going to what we called re-education seminars, where we talked about American history through the lens of people of color and all that sort of language. And through the duration of me working there, I realized that the people that I was working for were not as tolerant as I once thought that they were. Walking into the office each day, you heard nothing but racist rhetoric, completely aimed at people like you, white males, and I was raised by the white side of my family, so that really struck me hard. And I began to confront people who I was working with and asking them questions about not only their ideology when it came to race, but when it came to other issues. And nobody wanted to answer a single question that I had. So I was sort of forced to pull myself back and look for other answers outside of that, and that's where I found all these conservatives online. I found Larry Elder, I found Tom Sowell, I found PragerU, I found Dennis Prager specifically, and that sort of led to my awakening.
Interesting. Now, when you think of the organization Black Lives Matter, what do you think?
Would we even call it an organization at this point? When I first heard about Black Lives Matter, I was completely on board. I was a full supporter of BLM. You could have caught me walking around in high school wearing one of those I Can't Breathe t-shirts, and I was at every single protest that I could find. But as I woke up, I realized that Black Lives Matter was not doing anything for the Black community. If you go on their website, they talk explicitly about how their founders are trained Marxists and how they believe that the nuclear family is detrimental to America. Of course, the breakdown of the nuclear family is the worst thing that's ever happened to the Black community. So I realized that while Black Lives Matter had maybe a name that people could get behind, because everybody wants to say that Black Lives Matter, their vision and their mindset and what they were actually doing on the ground had nothing to do with that.
How do you think that they're able to deceive or trick so many people?
Because you hear these stories, specifically stories in reference to police brutality, and they are just everywhere. They're all over social media. They're all over the news. It seems like you can't even click a channel without hearing about it. And when you do that, your mind cognitively believes that this is some sort of pattern in America. And Black Lives Matter gets the added benefit of being able to point back to past transgressions in America of systemic racism and Jim Crow laws and say that what we are experiencing now is some sort of remnant of that. And people don't take the time to look into these acts of police brutality to see if they actually are patterns in America, which they're not. And it's easy to get tricked into that because you hear a sad story and you want to do something right, and Black Lives Matter says, here's the organization, here are the people who are doing something right.
Now, do you think that these ideologies, I mean, Black Lives Matter, they proclaim to be, they're self-proclaimed Marxists. Mm-hmm. So do you think that these ideologies and the rhetoric that they use serves to further divide people?
Oh, 100%. So if you look at what Marx did, of course, he divided up a nation, but he did so by class. Black Lives Matter is aiming to do the same thing, but they're doing that with race. And what we're seeing now is not only our school systems and our media, but really every facet of our society being enveloped in something called critical race theory, which does the exact same thing. Under critical race theory, really, me and you should not be having this conversation right now because you're an oppressor and I'm the oppressed, and we would need to break that power differential before we even went anywhere else. Of course, that's not true, but that is their aim, to divide us by race in this nation.
Amala Epinobi, thank you.
Thank you.
A new budget analysis shows how compound interest could soon affect U.S. fiscal policy. It predicts a $1.2 trillion increase in military costs over a decade. The House Armed Services Committee has endorsed an increase in U.S. military spending. That's through its passing of the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act last week. The move would represent a $38 billion boost over last year's Department of Defense budget. Supporters have set ambitious goals for the military in preparations for possible conflicts with Russia and China. But a tax expert is warning that it won't be possible to maintain these increases in the long term. In an article published by a DC-based think tank, Andrew Lotz explained, added up over 10 years and the defense hawks would have us spend more than $1.2 trillion, more on defense than current projections. He noted that lawmakers haven't yet proposed spending cuts to offset the fund's increase and cautioned that this will have an even bigger impact on taxpayers' pocketbooks. And that's all for the Capitol Report today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe below. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.